As I started making this presentation, I realized that what I was really just doing is just giving you advice. So 10 seemed like a good number. So I have 10 pieces of advice for you. And then based on that, I'm happy to field lots of questions at the end of the presentation. All right. Number one, good teaching is good teaching. It doesn't matter what the platform is that you are in. The way that we communicate about the physical sciences, about any science, about any phenomena is through this interaction between student and teacher, right? So what that means for me in terms of this new environment is that all of the things that I would want my students to be doing in a physical classroom, what I need to consider is how to make those things real in a virtual classroom. The initial conversations that were happening in our department, and I'm sure this happened across departments and across institutions, is there seemed to be a willingness to accept that what would happen in a normal lecture course could very easily just happen in an online platform. If I was going to give a lecture, then I can record that lecture and post it, right? However, I would argue that that's not really where the teaching was happening through just that direct instruction. There's an element of engagement and interactivity that's happening in the classroom environment that's lost in the online environment in this traditional way of just recording and posting asynchronous materials. What that really means is that it puts a lot of onus on the students to do the heavy lifting, to figure out what's important and how to use that information in a productive way. So I would argue that this moving from classroom to an online space is not a one-to-one transfer. There are a lot of things that are unique about the remote learning environment that we do need to consider as we move forward. However, at the end of the day, the strategies that you would have employed in a traditional classroom are the same strategies that you would want to employ in a virtual classroom. It's just that the platforms and some of the technicalities are going to be a little bit different. And so hopefully those are some of the things that we can get into in the question and answer at the end. The second thing that I think is extremely important to consider as we move into this kind of environment is that students need to know what it is that they need to do. And having very clear expectations for students is extremely important, especially when there is this element of unique individuality within the online learning environment for students. They're much more responsible for their own learning, and therefore your ability to tell them what it is that they need to do and how it is that they need to do those things becomes exceptionally important. And that really means setting a very clear standard from the get-go. And I would argue too, to make sure that those expectations are not just clear, but that they are sufficiently high and rigorous. Just because we're in an online classroom does not mean that the things that the students should be doing are any less important, any less valid, and that they should be learning something less than what they would have been learning in a traditional classroom. So making sure that those expectations are clear to the student and that the expectations align with what your expectations would have been for students in a traditional classroom become even more important in this kind of virtual space. Along with setting clear expectations, the ability to communicate with students, as many of you have already pointed out, is now quite different. Communication is taking place through a variety of virtual platforms at the moment, probably most commonly via email and chat functions, through posted announcements, and through posted materials. Making sure that students know where to find information and how to access that information becomes particularly important in this kind of remote instruction environment. And making sure that they know where those things are early is even more important. A lot of the confusion that students often have in a traditional classroom is when expectations are not clearly communicated, and therefore there's ambiguity about what they should be doing or how they should be doing it. Again, I think this is compounded in the virtual environment where students are going to have a variety of things that are being asked of them and a variety of platforms that they need to negotiate in order to be able to do those things successfully. And so making sure that they know how to access those materials, how to facilitate the kinds of interactions that you want them to be doing necessitates that you are communicating with them frequently about what it is that you expect, and also giving them feedback once they do execute those things. Feedback specifically, not just in the form of grades, but just in the form of constructive criticism about what it is that they're doing, how they're doing it, how to improve on what they're doing in a way that's going to help them access and continue to process information in a more independent fashion than they would have otherwise needed to do. And the last sort of beginning piece of advice that I have is be prepared. Know what it is that you are trying to execute and go in having experienced and try to utilize the variety of platforms that you're asking the students to use. Having said that, it's also extremely important that you are flexible in what it is that you're doing and how you go about doing it. If things aren't working, it's okay to change them and to adapt as you move forward to make sure that you're able to execute things in a way that you think is productive for the student, but also based on feedback from the students that you're able to facilitate a more robust and dynamic interaction with the student in this kind of platform. This part of the presentation now kind of gets into a little bit of traditional learning theory. And these are things that you might already be familiar with in a traditional teaching environment. And I guess I would argue all of these pieces of advice apply to the traditional classroom as well. They're just doubly important in this kind of remote instruction environment. In basing this kind of conversation around what we know about how people learn, there are some important caveats that we want to make sure that we carry into the remote instruction environment. And the first is that learning and teaching is not a transition model, or a transmission model. I can't just tell you something and you absorb that information. Telling is not teaching, and listening is not learning. There's a variety of interactions that need to take place in the learning environment, whether it's remote or in person, that are going to necessitate an interactivity with the material, whether that's between you and the student, or between the students and each other, or between the students and the material itself. There needs to be an active processing of the information that they are getting. And most of you are maybe already familiar with the concept of active learning. This is the current buzzword in educational literature at the moment. Active learning has a variety of connotations, but the basic gist is that students need to be processing the information that you're giving them in a way that allows them to engage more deeply with the material and think critically about what it is that they're doing and how they're doing it. Active learning studies have shown that students actually increase their exam performance by an average of a half a letter grade, and that it reduces failure rates in traditional lecture environments. Now, having said that, active learning strategies have not been robustly studied in a remote learning environment. In fact, most learning strategies have not been studied sufficiently in this kind of environment. So we're actually in the middle of a really unique educational experiment at the moment to see what it is that actually necessitates, or what is needed for students to be successful in this kind of environment. However, what students are doing is not any different than what they would have been doing in the classroom. Their ability to engage and think critically about the material necessitates that they engage with the material. And so active learning strategies that you would have been using in a traditional classroom environment are still carried over into this remote instructional environment. Now, having said that, the way in which you facilitate an active learning environment in a remote context becomes quite different. The second piece of learning theory that I wanted to bring into this conversation is that knowledge itself is individually constructed. And that this goes hand in hand with the previous statement about teaching is not telling the students what it is that they need to know. And the students can't just absorb that information. The student is actually actively engaged in constructing their own understanding of the world around them. However, that understanding is socially negotiated, which is important in this kind of remote instructional environment, that we facilitate social interactions between the student and the instructor, and between the students and each other, so that they can help build their understanding of the material as they move forward. This based on constructivism is predicated on the idea that human knowledge is constructed from experience. And so what experiences you're giving students in a remote educational environment create the basis for how they are understanding the material and what they are building as their own understanding of what it is that you're trying to teach. Now, all of that is being filtered through their perceptions coming through what it is that you're telling them or what it is that they're reading about. Words are processed separately from visual information in the processing centers of the brain. Uh, Ears are going to process auditory information while eyes are going to process visual information. If students are just reading material, that gets processed only by the eyes and not by the ears, which means that there is only a portion of the brain that is activated by that kind of information. If there's auditory information, so if you're recording lectures, if you're posting video content and the like, students get an opportunity to have a secondary access to process information through auditory channels. And so having multiple presentation modes allows students to facilitate multiple processing centers in the brain, which allows them to take in more pieces of information into short-term memory. Short-term memory is where students are taking in selected pieces of information from these auditory and visual channels and using that information combined with long-term memory storage to create a working model for how it is that they understand what it is that they're trying to do. Some of that information gets saved, some of that becomes long-term memory, but most of that information actually is forgotten. Right? And you've probably experienced this on your own if you've ever taken a class and crammed a whole bunch of information, and then a couple weeks later, you can't remember what it is that you were trying to do in that class, or you couldn't answer a question that you could have a few weeks earlier. What that means is that learning is not a linear process either. Right? Just because information comes in doesn't mean that it stays in. And so students are processing information in an iterative fashion. And that means that they need to have multiple opportunities to access that information, utilize that information meaningfully, and then also to retrieve these long-term memory storage components that are going to create more coherent active structures in the brain. What that really means is that students are relying not only on the information that you are giving them, but also on information that they already have. They're not coming into this environment as a blank slate, and they're not coming into the virtual environment as a blank slate. They're going to be taking what they already know and trying to integrate that with the new pieces of information that you're providing them. And so utilizing these kinds of learning theories to actively construct knowledge in a way that is meaningful in a remote learning environment is akin to what you would be doing in a traditional classroom anyway. And the last piece of this, and this is maybe it's not a great image that I could find, but it's probably the best to acknowledge all the different aspects of the social components to how people learn, is that all of that information that's being processed by the individual is still being socially negotiated. So language and perception, all of these things are being filtered or are filters through which people are going to integrate not just their prior knowledge, but also the new pieces of information that are being perceived in the environment. For example, we can call this color blue, but it's only blue because we all agree that it's blue, right? The language that we're using and the perception of this visual cue is telling us a certain kind of information. But what we agree to call it and how we agree to think about it is something that we as a community, as a collective, are deciding. And so for me, what that means is that it's extremely important that students are engaging with each other, with the instructor in an active conversation to understand the language that's being used and to better understand their own perceptions of how and when to utilize particular pieces of information. All of that information, not only is it socially negotiated, but it's culturally relevant. We're oftentimes trying to acclimate students into a way of thinking about the world that is scientific, and therefore we're trying to indoctrinate them into a way of thinking that is akin to how a scientist would think. And so that means that we need to engage them regularly in that kind of conversation. The next point that I think is important to consider, especially in this remote learning environment, is that different students are coming in at different points. As I noted earlier, students' prior knowledge is an important factor in how they understand the information that's being presented to them. And so students are not coming in without their own baggage, which means that what you are allowing students to do is predicated on what they can already do. And so having multiple points of entry for me really means scaffolding learning events so that students can access different pieces of information at different points in time to facilitate a more coherent or more robust understanding of the information that you're trying to get across to them. This is particularly useful when we talk about things like informal learning environments, think like a science museum, for example. If you walk into a science museum, the artifacts that are there and the presentations need to appeal to 5-year-olds and 85-year-olds and everybody in between, which means that there's information that's being presented at all different kinds of levels. That should be true in a traditional classroom as well, that students have multiple pieces of information or multiple places that they could start to think about the material in a more coherent way. However, in an online environment, that becomes somewhat limited depending on the platforms that we choose to present information to students. So giving students multiple chances to process information or process it in slightly different ways, giving them multiple opportunities to practice information, and giving them multiple ways to think about the information, whether that's from you, the instructor, or from each other as they think about the material. That gives them a variety of different ways to think about that particular concept, which at the end of the day creates a more robust understanding of the material rather than just providing them a single point of access. And I think this is where platforms become particularly useful. So right now I'm presenting on a tablet, which means that I can give students not only multiple ways to think about material, but I can also give them time to process. In a traditional classroom environment, we might take time to write out information on the board or use the space and time of the class to act out or depict information. Right? If I wanted to draw structures, if I wanted to provide other information to students, if I wanted to give them an opportunity to process information, the time that it takes me to actually write things down is important processing time for the student, right? If you're presenting things in an online forum and you're doing it only with PowerPoint, for example, quite often the information is being presented so quickly that students have a really difficult time accessing and understanding all of the information because it's happening so fast. Therefore, they're only able to pay attention to certain pieces of information and not all of it. Whereas if you're utilizing some of these more traditional strategies where you would normally be writing information, solving problems together as a group, walking through your own thinking with students, that gives them time to not only emulate the strategies they're using and model their own thinking after yours, but it also gives them the time and space to write down that information and to process it in a more complete way. So utilizing platforms that allow you to give students the time and space to access that information gives them another place to start when they're thinking about what it is that you are trying to communicate with them. And I think this is a good point to stop and consider that the technology that we're using here is something that we need to ensure that students have access to. Issues of access and equity are particularly important in this kind of remote instructional environment for a variety of reasons. Students may not all have access to the same technologies. They may not all have access to stable internet sources. They may not, even if they do have access to those, they may not have access to quiet spaces where they can go and work or participate in a discussion or take an exam. And so these are considerations that we want to make. We want students to be aware that these are considerations that the instructors are taking into account, and that we have multiple ways to think about how to give students equitable access. Equitable does not necessarily mean equal, so that students that need additional time or space, if we can give those allowances and still ensure the validity and the rigor of the materials that they're working with, those are things that we should take into account in this kind of environment. An additional aspect of access and equity, though, is how we consider what it is that students are doing and how we give them credit for what they're doing. So at this point, I'm going to show a short little video. If you've seen this video before, don't spoil it for anybody. What I'm going to ask you to do in a minute, I'm going to show you a short YouTube video where you're going to see 6 players. They're wearing white shirts or black shirts, and they have 2 basketballs. The white shirt players are going to pass the basketballs between the white shirt players, and the black shirt players are going to do the same thing. And what I want you to do is just focus on the players wearing a white shirt and count how many times they pass the basketball back and forth, okay? All right, so the correct answer, if you're counting, I know that went by kind of quickly, is 16. The white shirt basketball players pass the basketball back and forth 16 times. And if you are familiar with this video, there's an older one called The Invisible Gorilla. There's actually a gorilla that walks across the screen, and about half of the people that have never seen this video before don't see the gorilla at all. So I'm gonna.
Correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half miss the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
So I think this is relevant to our conversation around access and equity at this point as well, because quite often the way that we evaluate students, especially in this new remote environment, is to give them traditional assessments that are in a quiz or exam kind of format. And those quizzes and exams quite often get timed, which means that students are really being graded on the quickness with which they can provide an answer. And while facility with information might be a marker of knowledge, it's not the only way that we can evaluate what students know and how they know it. So equity issues around these kinds of timed events mean that students that didn't have that prior preparation, that didn't know that they should be looking for a gorilla in that kind of environment or in that piece of information or in that data set, whatever it is that they're getting access to. If they're not primed to know what it is that they're supposed to do or how to do it, it may not be that they can't understand that information, it's just that they're missing some of the crucial pieces of information. Which means that not only do we need to ensure that students have access to that information, but that we help them understand and process that information in a meaningful way. Quite often that means cueing them to pay attention to the things that we think are important, but then second to that is giving them access to ways of demonstrating knowledge that don't necessarily rely on their ability to show us what they already knew about a phenomenon. Because then what we're really testing them on is their prior knowledge, not what it is that they're learning in the environment itself. So the last couple of pieces of advice then are based mostly around assessment. And again, all of these things are things that apply to the traditional classroom as well. But in a remote instructional environment, these kinds of measures of student learning become even more important because we don't have other metrics of participation or evaluation where we can look and check in with students and see how well they're doing, how they're processing the information. even just the visual cues that students would give in a traditional classroom environment are quite often lost in this remote instructional environment. So what that means for assessment purposes is that it's important to consider what it is that we're assessing students on. And are those assessments aligned to what we want students to know? Quite often, the way that assessments are constructed in a traditional instructional environment are, let's say, a teacher will say, I want students to know information from chapters 1 through 10. And then they construct a series of lectures or other kinds of opportunities for students to learn about the materials in chapters 1 through 10. And then at the end of that, they create an exam or some other kind of assessment where they ask a series of questions that test bits and pieces of the information that was presented in chapters 1 through 10. And what I'm proposing is that students' assessment of their knowledge should not be based on the information that was initially taught. It should be that we first construct what learning objectives students need to know. Chapters 1 through 10 is not a sufficient set of learning objectives, right? Instead, I would go through and articulate what are the key learning outcomes from that material? What is the big picture? What do students need to know and walk away with from this class? Quite often, there's information in that kind of textbook material that is either minutia or is details that are not particularly relevant to the class that they're in, or the instructor does not find them to be the most meaningful piece of information. So if they're not meaningful, then why are we teaching students about them? And if they're not meaningful, why would we ever assess them on those things? So it's not enough just to say that we're covering this material. Instead, you would want to really start by defining what is important. And once we've defined what's important, then we should start by figuring out how are we going to assess that and make the assessment the first thing that we're planning, not the last thing that we're planning, so that we can directly align the assessment to learning outcomes. And once we know how we're going to assess students on those things, then we can build learning experiences that directly allow students to gain access to that kind of information, allow them to practice the information and/or concepts in a particular kind of way, and then we give them the assessments that allow them to demonstrate that knowledge. This strategy is called a backwards assessment model, and is something that, again, we should be employing in all learning environments, not just a remote learning environment. However, in the remote learning environment, if we start with what it is that we want students to know and build assessments that allow them to demonstrate that kind of knowledge, then that might actually change what information we want to present to students, how we want them to practice the information, how we want them to talk to each other. And it really guides a lot of the things that students will be doing in the remote environment itself. And the last big piece of advice that I would have is that students are being asked to demonstrate their knowledge through what I would call traditional assessments, which are quizzes and exams. But an assessment can be much more than that. Assessments can be projects, assessments can be conversations, assessments could be interactions, they can be iterative. There's a variety of ways in which we can allow students to demonstrate what they know. And therefore, we should be building assessments that allow students to demonstrate what they know and not just regurgitate back pieces of information. Specifically, in this kind of remote instructional environment, one of the concerns that I've heard voiced quite frequently from other faculty is their concern about academic integrity. If I give students an exam, how do I know that they're not just going to Google the answers? Now, this is maybe more of a philosophical conversation, but I would argue that what I would want from my students to be successful from my class is I would want them to be able to take a question, go out into the world, and find the resources necessary to answer that question correctly. And correctly, I guess, is maybe in a scientifically acceptable way, we'll call that correctly, right? And so if that means that they can just easily Google the answer, then I would argue that that is a successful way of answering the question. Now, it doesn't mean that I've necessarily tested what that student can recall without additional supports, without additional resources. But in this kind of environment, I would argue that that's not necessarily the important feature of what we're trying to test. So we could try and test students on individual knowledge like we traditionally do in a traditional classroom environment with in-person proctored exams, where students are really dependent on their own internal knowledge to demonstrate their understanding. However, in this kind of environment, I would say we're really freed to allow students to demonstrate how they could demonstrate knowledge in a variety of different ways that includes seeking outside resources, that allows them to have access to not just materials from the internet, but also materials from each other. And so collaboration in these kinds of online platforms is something that we could actually utilize to our advantage to allow students to work together to solve more complex problems. Now, what that really means, though, is that we need to design different assessments. If I'm still giving a traditional multiple choice assessment in an online environment, then students can very easily just Google the answers, get a correct outcome, and move on without really knowing very much material. However, I can ask them more complex questions. One of the useful strategies to think about the kinds of questions that we could allow students to ask is by utilizing Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a way of thinking about how students can demonstrate knowledge. And the idea of Bloom's is that the simplest kind of knowledge is known as remembering. Remembering is the ability to recall basic facts, basic information, to be able to define things, to be able to replicate answers. This is traditional rote memorization of information. And to a large extent, this is what we still test students on in a traditional classroom environment. Maybe we venture to the second level of Bloom's taxonomy and allow students to demonstrate understanding. Here, we might ask students to classify things or describe information, to discuss or explain, but they're really still utilizing basic bits of piece of information and trying to apply potential concepts to tie each of those pieces of information to each other. In a remote instructional environment, I would argue that what we want to be able to ask students to do are things that are more complex or more dynamic than just understanding and remembering. If students can apply information to solve a unique problem, if they can analyze a data set, if they can evaluate or defend a judgment or create an argument and critique a particular argument, or even design their own assessments and create their own materials and formulate their own understandings of how and when and who can do and apply this kind of information, then they're demonstrating a much more robust understanding of the material than just answering a few multiple choice questions. So by changing the structure of the assessments themselves and allowing students to demonstrate understanding in ways that are more complex and more dynamic, we can develop a more complete understanding of their own knowledge base. Right? This might mean that students do need to have open book assessments so that they can build on prior resources. They might have group assessments where they work with each other to create projects or demonstrate solutions to a particular problem. And in this kind of environment, again, we have the opportunity to explore some of these different strategies. And so I think what I would argue is that this is a unique opportunity to experiment in the remote instructional environment. If things aren't working, and if students don't seem to be learning the material in a way that's meaningful, there's no prior precedent that says you can't change what it is that you're doing or how you're doing it. So the last piece of advice is not my own. So I didn't number this number 10 or number 11. Instead, this is a quote that I found particularly helpful as I started to think about what my own classroom was going to look like this quarter, in that all of us are just trying to do a good job. And this quote by Voltaire I thought was particularly important. Perfect is the enemy of good. It's not going to be perfect. It just isn't. It's never going to be perfect, even in the best of circumstances. Teaching is a dynamic event. Learning is an iterative process. And it's uniquely individualized to the students and the context and the classroom and the space that we're in. And so what that means is that even if you did the exact same thing from quarter to quarter, you're going to get a different outcome, which really means that teaching should be a reflective process, something that we engage with on a regular basis that is constantly changing. It's never going to be one thing. And we can't make the perfect teacher. We can't make the perfect learning environment, and we don't have the perfect students. And with those things in mind, we should be striving for better, not perfect. So in this kind of new environment, again, challenge yourself to evaluate what you're doing on a regular basis. Is it effective? Do students seem to be learning? Are they demonstrating sufficient understanding of materials? And if they aren't, change. Do something different. Try it out and use this as an opportunity to experiment with your own teaching strategies, with your own classroom context for the way in which students engage, how they engage, and what they do. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions about how we might want to think about facilitating these kinds of strategies in a remote instructional environment, or the specific platforms that might be useful for how we would want to use this material. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bussey, for a very informative presentation. We will now move on to the Q&A portion of this virtual event. So just as a friendly reminder, if you have not yet entered your question, please visit www.sli.do and enter code M700. So for the first question I see on the screen is, in your opinion, what is the goal of a lab class? And how can we facilitate these goals when students' interaction with the material is limited to data analysis?
That's a great question. Labs are something that we've been really struggling to think about. What does that look like in a remote environment? So this is actually something that we've been studying for a while, not related to remote instruction, just what is the purpose of the laboratory environment itself. And for the sciences, lab is a unique experience for students. It's one of the only times that they get access to equipment, that they actually engage with the process of science in a, I would say, not realistic, but pseudo-realistic way, where they're mimicking the processes of science and making measurements using the techniques and the experimentation processes that we potentially laid out for them. And so in this remote instructional environment, students don't have access to the unique hands-on applications of a traditional teaching lab. Having said that, I think the hands-on part of the laboratory environment, while extremely important, is only one of the important aspects. As was noted in the question, data analysis is a hugely important part of the laboratory environment that students can do without having to collect the data themselves. By giving students large pools of data and collected data sets, or even individualized data sets, they're still able to engage with and think critically about how you would collect this material, what kinds of processes you would need to engage with, what kind of techniques you would need to use. You can still engage them in the procedural knowledge that they would need to know in terms of accessing and utilizing that information, but then also the analysis and conclusions that they can draw from that information. So I would argue that data analysis is an important aspect of the laboratory environment that we already emphasize in a traditional teaching lab, and that we can continue to emphasize in a remote instructional environment. Now, I think there are a couple other things that are useful to think about in this kind of environment as well. We don't often talk to students explicitly about scientific writing. It's often assumed that students can write scientifically, and or they are critiqued in a lab report for their abilities to demonstrate scientific writing. But it's not often an explicit instructional opportunity. We don't often just talk to students about how do you write an abstract, how do you write a conclusion or result section explicitly, and we don't teach them that explicitly. And so potentially we now have time and space to allow students to develop scientific writing skills that they may not have otherwise been able to be instructed about. This is also potentially an opportunity for them to access the primary literature and look at how do we understand this, this information, not just from a verification laboratory experiment, but how did we come to understand this information from practices of science traditionally? I think one of the criticisms of the teaching lab is that we actually limit students' ability to understand how science was done, because we give them a very constrained way of accessing a particular piece of information. We already often know the outcome of their experiment, right? However, that's not science. That's not how science operates. And therefore, the experience in the teaching lab is somewhat limited. A research laboratory environment is much more emblematic of the way in which we process information and that we deal with failure. Failure is an important part of science. It's often a very meaningful part of science that we don't often include for students in the teaching laboratory environment. So I think what this does is it opens up the possibility for us to understand different aspects of the nature of science in a way that is not limited to the specific experiments that they would be doing in a class, but allows them to still access the way in which the process of science and the way in which we understand scientific knowledge to be generated. How students get access to that information can definitely be expanded upon in the remote instructional environment.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question, I'm going to combine the next two because they're very similar. Do you have advice for engaging students during office hours? And what recommendations do you have for organizing and managing virtual office hours for a large class?
Yes, so I think this goes with any kind of large group synchronous activity in a remote instructional environment, is that students quite often are not going to be able to generate spontaneously meaningful questions. They might be able to point to a specific problem that they're struggling with, or they might be able to talk about an experience that they had where they had trouble processing something, or where they might have run into an issue at some point. But a more holistic understanding of what is missing in how they are processing the information is quite often lacking, because that's sort of the point. They don't know what they don't know. And so instead, having students work with each other on particular problems often becomes a more meaningful experience, where students can explain to each other how to solve the problems. I think from my perspective as a professor, it's actually quite helpful for the students to have to explain their own understanding to each other. For one, it means that they have to be able to articulate what it is that they think they know. And if they can articulate it, it demonstrates to them that they do have a way of connecting bits and pieces of information. And if they can't articulate what they understand, it points out to them that they don't have a sufficient knowledge base to be able to understand what it is that's going on if they can't explain it to somebody else. Quite often, being able to teach somebody something about a piece of information is the most powerful student experience that they could have. It's a really valuable learning experience. So what I would say is, in these kinds of environments, allowing students to work with each other becomes really important. Now, how do you facilitate that in a virtual environment? That can definitely be challenging. Having some kind of question or questions for them to work with, whether they're questions that are brought to you by the students that they're struggling with, or questions that you created to allow them to practice some of the information, having a specific task for them to work on can be quite meaningful. One of the strategies that I've been using quite frequently lately are breakout rooms. In Zoom, breakout rooms allow you to put students into small groups and allow them to work with each other. For a large group, that can be quite effective, so that they can talk with maybe 2 or 3 other students for a little while. If they can bounce ideas off of each other, sometimes they can start to figure out the solution on their own. And if they can't, then they can come back usually with a more refined question that we can then redirect them to a piece of information that they might be overlooking, or a strategy that they might not be using properly, or something of that effect. So I would say, as much as you could do with small group interactions with students, that would be my suggestion for a more meaningful kind of conversation, rather than a large group of students sort of staring blankly at you through the screen, waiting for you to just figure out how best to help them. Allowing them to talk to each other is usually a much more meaningful kind of interaction.
Wonderful. And the next question is, for a student taking a class with only asynchronous material, meaning just recorded lectures, how do you suggest being successful in it?
That is a great question. I don't know that is the best way of presenting information. However, I realize that that's actually probably quite often what students are going to get in this kind of environment, especially if faculty have limited technological capacity to be able to present information or engage with the students in a meaningful way. So having said that, if you are being given information, again, the onus is now really being placed on the student to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So I would treat this like you would a traditional classroom environment. take notes, go through and listen to the material and write down what it is that you think you're hearing, what it is that you think that they're saying. Seek outside resources. So try and confirm what it is that you're hearing in these kinds of recorded lectures with material that you might be able to find in a textbook format or with a useful Google search or the like, so that you can get some corroborating information about what it is that you're being asked to do. Again, that takes some extra processing. You're not just going to absorb the information by listening to it. I've seen students just listen to podcasts, for example, on like 2 times speed, just so that they can get the information, and they think somehow that's just going to like seep in. It's not. You still have to do something with it. So I would encourage you to engage with the material like you would in a traditional classroom environment. The second thing I would suggest is try and find at least one other person in that class that you can work with, or somebody who's taken that class relatively recently that you can collaborate with. Being able to talk through your own thinking is extremely valuable. That's essentially what you would be doing in a discussion kind of environment, in a study group, or the like. And again, this really means that the student needs to take the onus, or now has the onus placed on them to do the creating of those groups, to allow them to discuss with each other what it is that they think that they're learning. And allowing somebody to give you feedback can be just as valuable as your ability to explain information to them. And so as a group, I find that students can work much more effectively than if they're trying to work only individually. The last thing I would say is use the assessments that are being given in the class, not just as your ability to demonstrate knowledge, but also as an opportunity for feedback, which is ideally really what they're supposed to be. If you are not doing well on a particular kind of assessment, figure out what it is that is not being able to be translated for you. What are the problems that you're missing? What are the kinds of things that those problems have in common? Are they conceptual? Are they mathematical in nature? What is the thing that seems to be a roadblock? So that if you can identify what that problem area is, then again, you can go and ask a more refined question that might allow you to get more specific feedback about how to be more successful in that environment. So I think really this requires the student to do a lot of the work here. But at the end of the day, if that is done well, then that can actually be a very meaningful learning experience, because you've had to put in a tremendous amount of time and effort to really understand the information. Learning is not a simple process. And the fact that you're spending time and effort to learn the material actually might help build a more robust understanding of the information anyway.
Wonderful. Looks like we have time for maybe about 1 or 2 more questions. So I'm just going to ask a few more that I pulled from the RSVP. So how do we adjust our courses in light of the additional anxiety and stress many students are facing because of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think making sure that you have high standards with empathy is a key variable here. We're all under stress right now. Everybody is being forced into a very new kind of experience. Having said that, that stress is going to play out in different ways for different people. And so for students, how we demonstrate our ability to handle or process that information is going to be different. And so keeping that in mind as students come in with various issues, I think it is important to give allowance for students to try and demonstrate information in ways that might be slightly different than what's being asked, but still meaningful. Having opportunities to access information outside of time-restricted or technology-restrictive ways. So having multiple ways to disseminate information to students, having multiple opportunities for students to demonstrate knowledge back, I think becomes really meaningful. And giving them the opportunity to, and I guess, again, this sort of goes back to a general teaching philosophy that learning is not linear, and that it is something that takes practice and time, that if they don't demonstrate information correctly early on, that doesn't mean that they should be penalized or sort of doomed from the get-go. That if they can demonstrate learning by the end of the process, that's really the goal. And so having course policies in place that might allow students to replace earlier grades or low grades, or being able to demonstrate knowledge in a different assessment, giving them choice in what they do, so that maybe they have a few different questions that they could answer, and so they can demonstrate maybe more coherent understanding of the information by answering question A instead of question B. So I think there are lots of different strategies that allow students to have some agency in this process, which I think for a lot of students, that's really what's lacking now, is they don't have control over the environment, over what's happening, and giving them the opportunity to demonstrate knowledge in a way that they can control becomes a little bit more comforting in that process. The second thing I would say is give them very clear expectations. That's the other thing that I find quite frequently with students when they express anxiety. It's often because they don't know what's being expected or how it's being evaluated. And so if those things can be clearly articulated to students, then that can go a long way in mitigating some of the stress that's associated with the traditional classroom environment, let alone this unique pandemic situation that we find ourselves in that's going to add just additional stress to the situation.
Absolutely. And final question, what are strategies to maintain productivity and structure in your workday?
I can speak from personal experience on this. I have found that I procrastinate very well in this environment. And so for myself, I need to have a set schedule for things that I know that at this time, I'm going to do this activity for this amount of time. Make sure that you give yourself breaks in that schedule, because you only have a limited amount of processing time, right? Even in a regular work environment, you would have times where you're going to get up or walk around or move from place to place, from meeting to meeting. Those times of distraction are important. And so at home, those distractions can quite often take up additional time, right? I find myself doing the dishes or other activities around the house that I don't necessarily need to be doing at that time, but it's not the work that I should be doing and allows me to procrastinate a little bit. So knowing what those things are, and if you find yourself engaging in activities that are not your primary focus at that time, to re-engage. So having a set schedule can be quite useful for that. The other thing I would suggest is that, at least again, this is from personal experience, just showering and getting dressed quite often makes the transition more meaningful, that I am now going to do work, I'm going to be in this space, and I'm going to do something productive. If I roll out of bed and I'm still in pajamas and I try and do work, then there's a very blurry line between work and not work. And that I find not to be very helpful or productive for myself. So having a set schedule for things and dressing to participate in those activities, even though nobody else is going to see me, those are things that I found to be really useful just for myself to be able to engage and make progress on things that I need to do.
Wonderful. So that wraps up the Q&A portion of the event. Once again, a huge thank you to Dr. Bussey for taking the time to share his knowledge, personal experience, and wisdom with us. Also, thank you to Sloan Scholars and staff for participating in this virtual event. On behalf of the Student Success Center, we hope that you all stay healthy and safe during this time of uncertainty. Thank you all, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Bye, thank you.